We keep on hearing about internet gaming disorder, that our kids are using their smartphones way too much, and of course that it's having some kind of a developmental impact that's negative in their lives. And yet, for some reason, the conversation keeps on happening. And for many of us as parents, it almost feels like we throw up the white flag, raise the white flag, you know what I mean? And start to wonder, is it even worth it? Is it that big of a deal? Everybody else is doing it. It's just the world today. I'm tired. And apart from that, we kind of like our own Instagram feeds as well. Like, it's pretty easy to settle into that. Today, a big conversation about internet gaming disorder and smartphone overuse in Australian primary and secondary school kids. I'm so excited for this conversation. It will be practical, it will be helpful, and it will set you on the path for where we want to go in helping our children to flourish and maybe even live a little more screen-free. Stay with us. Hello and welcome to the Happy Families Podcast, real parenting solutions every day on Australia's most downloaded parenting podcast. My name's Dr. Justin Coulson, and today I am joined by a frequent contributor to the pod and somebody who is fast becoming a wonderful friend and wise guy to talk to around all these kinds of things. Doctor, it's official now. The PhD's completed. Dr. Brad Marshall, the Chief Research Officer of the all-new Control Shift, also known as the Unplugged Psychologist, and a researcher at Macquarie University. Brad, thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having me again, Justin. It's good to be back.
So you've published a brand new article with Wayne Warburton, who we recently had on the pod, talking about some more of these kinds of topics. The name of the article is Internet Gaming Disorder and Smartphone Overuse in Australian Primary School and Secondary Children, Prevalence and Developmental Impacts. Now, I know that most people who will listen to this don't like the academic jargon, the dense academic speak. So walk us through this one, because almost every single person who's listened to this pod has a child who is either in primary school or secondary school. They are in front of screens, devices, they are playing games, they do often own their own smartphone. How prevalent is the reality that they've got them? But more than that, how prevalent is this smartphone overuse? How do you even define that? What is it? Let's hear all the details.
Okay. Yeah, so I think we need to start with when myself and my research colleagues set out with this study, it was very much designed around. We have two major studies in Australia, one by Professor Daniel King in Adelaide, and the other was by my research partner, Professor Wayne Warburton, who have done prevalence, which for those at home parents, it basically just means what's the percentage of kids that have an issue with internet gaming disorder or gaming issues or smartphone addiction or smartphone overuse. So we only have two studies to date, and they were both pre-COVID, Justin. So the question then always that got asked in the clinic and when I was speaking at schools and other places was, has this gone up over COVID? Or usually parents were just saying it's definitely gone up. And we weren't sure about that. So we did this study in 2023. Now, what we did was we went to schools and we asked them if we could survey kids within schools. And first of all, I should note that one of the limitations here is we could only use independent schools. If any of you remember, 2 years ago, there was a freeze on research in Catholic schools and public schools at the time. So this is only independent schools. But what we were trying to achieve is, number one, the biggest sample to date in Australian populations. And number two, we wanted a wider variety of ages, because one of the things I was critical of in previous research is that it focused on this sort of teenage 15, 16, 17-year-olds. But I was seeing in the clinic kids age 8, 10, 12. So I wanted to go younger. I took what you might call the more difficult path in this because I wanted the younger sample kids. So year 4 to year 8 is what these kids are. Now, I will acknowledge as well, there are not as many primary school age kids as I would have liked in this sample. It's still high school heavy.
Yeah.
But as far as what the prevalence is, the numbers that we actually found, the pertinent numbers are, first of all, the amount of hours on a recreational screens that our kids are spending is about 9 hours a day for our high school kids, year 7, year 8, and about 6 hours, just over 6 hours for our primary school kids.
All right, so I've got to interrupt you here. This is critical that we make this distinction between what you might call or consider necessary use and what you've called recreational use. So can we just get a quick definition here? 9 hours or 6 hours, depending on the age, on average. Worth highlighting as well, on average means that 50% are above that and 50% are below, right? That's what the average is. So there are 50% of kids who are getting more than 9 hours per day on their screens. And
high school kids.
And it's recreational use that we're talking about here. So just break that down for me.
Yeah, I mean, so again, there's no perfect way to measure this. The only perfect way to measure this would be to literally install tracking devices on your kids' devices, right? Which is not possible. So what this is it's asking kids to break down how many hours in the last few weeks, how many hours per day are you spending on a console, how many hours on your phone, how many hours on your, home devices, gaming laptop, et cetera, iPad. Now, some of this may be a little bit confused with school time, and that's one of the difficulties in measuring this, because obviously if you get a 10, 12-year-old kid, they may interpret that, read the question quickly. But ultimately, we were not targeting your use of PowerPoint in a, history lesson in year 7. That's not what we were asking there. In fact, one of the limitations of this is the reverse. If you ask most kids these days, how many kids in class are actually gaming or on YouTube in class, they'll say that a fair amount of them are. And we were ruling that stuff out as well, right? So we were talking about outside of school hours. So those hours of 6 and 9 hours for primary and high school kids, I think what's really important to note here is that I gave this testimony to the Australian Parliament last year in the social media inquiries. And that is distinctly different to what the E-Safety Commissioner reported. The E-Safety Commissioner told that inquiry that their research indicates what was the equivalent of about 2 hours a day of recreational screen use. It's nowhere even close to what we found. So I'll also point out that our data is very consistent in the amount of hours to the OECD statistics that came out in May 2025.
Yeah, we talked about that when it came out on the podcast. These numbers are big. Not 9 hours of recreational screen use every day. So let's say a teenager, I know that you're highlighting primary versus high school, so let's stick with the high schools for a moment. Let's say that the average teenager should be getting, even if we call it 9 hours of sleep a night, right? We'd like them to be a little bit more than that, but let's call it 9 hours. Then they've got to go to school and all the travel and all the stuff around that. So we've got at least another 7 to 8 hours. I'm not really good at live maths, but that tells me that we're somewhere around about 16, 17, 18 hours of the day is kind of gone. And then we've got to find 9 hours for screen. They're supposed to have, many of them have jobs, they've got relationships, they're involved in structured activities outside of school. It doesn't fit, which means that stuff that matters is going by the by so that they can stare at their screens, play games, look at Instagram, TikTok, that kind of thing.
Yeah, spot on. And that's exactly why in this study, myself and my colleagues at Macquarie University developed what we call the Screen Developmental Impact Questionnaire. We wanted a way to measure what the developmental impacts are on children and teenagers in a variety of different areas. So education, social development, physical health, emotional, and behaviour. Now, keep in mind, these are students that are responding to these questionnaires. So this is not a parent's view. This is what students are telling us. And we did find in this study that there are significant impacts in all of those areas of development when you get into these high levels of either smartphone overuse or gaming.
So, Brad, this is the crux of the study, and this is really why I wanted to talk to you. Because it's one thing to say, all right, kids are using their devices a lot. We've got smartphone overuse. We've got a lot of activity happening on screens. And it comes to, you and I stand up in front of groups all day, every day and say our children's well-being is being undermined by screens. And there are plenty of adults who will point to the things that they're concerned about. But when we hear it in their words, and when we've got something that actually measures what the impact is, then there's more heft, there's more thunk, I guess. You know, like you're dropping a big book on the table rather than a pamphlet, and it's like, okay, there's something weighty here. So walk me through, what did these young people themselves identify when it comes to the impact of their use of screens?
I think what we actually have to do is just take one step backwards here, if I may, Justin, because we've missed here a key part around the prevalence. So not only did we measure the amount of hours, but we also measured how many kids have what we would call internet gaming disorder the diagnostic term, on a screening tool. It's not diagnostic because you've not done a clinical interview, but it's a screening tool, which is a common tool. And how many have a smartphone addiction? So we found that 4% of Australian kids have a either subclinical or clinical gaming disorder, and about 9.9% of Australian kids have medium to high levels of smartphone addiction or overuse. Now, if we just extrapolate those numbers, and I know I've talked to you about these numbers roughly on the podcast before, right? But we're talking about 100 to 120,000 Australian kids with gaming disorder and about 400,000 with a smartphone overuse or addiction. The key element here being, in this study, this was the first arm of a trial, and the second arm was a follow-up where we were actually going to invite parents into a parent intervention treatment trial. So that is a fancy term for those parents at home of, we're going to help the parents in the second trial. So in order to do that, the ethics board at Macquarie University said, hey, you really need to tell these kids that you're going to tell their parents if their use is high. So we did. You can imagine how many kids aged 10 to 14 are going to read that and go, there's no way I'm answering this accurately. So those numbers that I've just quoted you, the hours and the percentages, they're probably understating the issue.
So now that we've got these prevalence data and we understand that, I'm going to, forgive me for being imprecise and rounding, but it's just easy to remember round numbers. Let's say about 5% of kids are showing up with a subclinical or clinical gaming disorder, and about 10%-ish are showing up with medium to high smartphone addiction or overuse. How are they seeing the impacts? Where does this what does this mean at a practical level in their daily lives?
Yeah, well, one of the most practical things out of this study is that we didn't actually find any notable differences in those prevalence rates between primary school and high school. So what that tells us is that both of these phenomena, gaming disorder and smartphone overuse, start in primary school.
Yeah,
okay?
The great rewiring of the adolescent brain begins at around about the age of 7 or 8 once these kids start to really invest in these screens.
Correct. But I think what you're getting at, obviously, is the developmental impacts.
Right.
And that's sort of what I'm excited about as well, excited and scared at the same time, of course. But we had these 5 main categories, and what our investigations found is that there was probably more indicative of 4 categories. And so the emotional impacts, the social and physical were tied together in our exploratory factor analysis. For those at home that don't know what that is, don't worry. It's just sort of fancy stuff that's a little bit researchy. Behavioural impacts and education. So we had a list of questions that we asked them in different domains. So for example, with education impact, there would have been a question, or there was a question there around, have screens or gaming ever gotten in the way of you handing in an assessment or getting your homework in? So that is an example of a question or an item that was in measuring the educational impacts. Now, what we found for all 4 of these areas is all 4 were significant in the research. But what we also found is that there are no real impacts for kids that didn't meet criteria for internet gaming disorder or smartphone overuse. Then we have a step up to the impacts that were there in developmental domains for kids that had smartphone overuse or addiction. Then a step up again in developmental impacts for subclinical gaming disorder, and then a step up again for kids with clinical gaming disorder. So what that tells us is that the developmental impacts on our children and teenagers is greatest for gaming disorder, and then significant for smartphone addiction or overuse, and then down to the normal, quote unquote, sample at the bottom.
All right, so Brad, now that we've gone through the study, there's a bunch of practical implications that every parent wants to know the answer to, and these things, I think, are just vitally important for us to discuss. First off, I want to clarify something, and I think this really requires it just requires a minute or so of elaboration. Gaming per se, there's a values question. Are you okay with your child playing first-person shooter games or having the sound on and lots of strangers in your living room who are swearing and using inappropriate slurs and epithets and so on? But let's say that you've got your values sorted out and the kids know which games are okay from a values perspective and which games are not. The research evidence seems to indicate that playing games, so long as it's not at an excessive level, at a high level, playing too much, that is internet gaming disorder, playing it pathologically and not being able to survive without the game, does have a whole lot of benefits. It seems to be really good for the kids socially. It seems to be quite good for them emotionally and even cognitively. The thing that I see in the data, no matter how many studies I look at and no matter how much I try to find an argument to just say, let's get the kids off games, I'm not finding an argument that says that it's bad for them until it reaches an unsafe or unhealthy level. Fundamentally, gaming is a whole lot of fun for a whole lot of people, and they don't have any negative effects. Tell me where I'm wrong, or still man the argument that I'm making so parents can go, okay, I can breathe a little safely here.
There are opportunities and risks that come with gaming. And so I certainly should acknowledge the opportunities here. With social connection, with mastery, there is research and evidence that suggests there are benefits in smallish doses. The problem is that it's different for every child as to when that dose becomes too much.
Right.
And so, that could be 30 minutes a day for one child. It could be 2 hours for another child. And that's why we developed the developmental impact scale, because we really wanted to know and have parents understand what are the areas of red flags that you can look out for. And all of this is public knowledge. You'll see in this paper that we list all of the domains in the supplementaries as well. But I guess to sort of come back to your question of that opportunity versus that risk, what I struggle with as a researcher and a clinician is that many of the research articles and papers and information we get about the benefits of gaming have significant conflicts of interest.
They're funded by the industry.
They are, yeah. And so it is very difficult. So I'm not sitting here saying that every single piece of evidence is that way, but a lot of it is.
Mm.
And that becomes really difficult, because if you have a researcher that is funded by the industry either directly or indirectly, and they are publishing beneficial data around this, we've seen that before, Justin. We've seen that in smoking. We've seen that in sugar. We've seen that in tobacco. We've seen this play before.
Yeah.
And so we have to look at both sides. And what we're saying is that when overuse in gaming becomes an issue, the developmental impacts are fairly significant. Now, what that all boils down to for me, if I just sort of summarize my own thoughts on this, is that I firmly believe that this is a decision for individual parents to make about their own child's gaming. So I'm not advocating banning gaming. That's not what I'm saying, okay? What I am saying is, how do we as a government, as health policy, as researchers, allow parents to actually set limits in parental controls for their child? Because at the moment, they don't have that. Most parental controls are just, we've talked about this before on the last episode, anyway. Most parental controls are easy to get around. And so I believe we should be letting parents make the decision and actually apply that. At the moment, they can't.
Brad, let's talk practical. People have listened to the study that you've done. They've heard that we've got pretty high percentages, really. I mean, I think concerningly high percentages of kids who are using their devices in an overuse or compulsive way, that there's gaming disorder at a level that is really concerning. And any family who's going through it, they know of just the psychological and emotional earthquakes that happen every single time there's a request to get off the screen. It's time to eat. It's time to go to bed. It's time to go to school. They're dealing with some really, really big challenges. But if I've got a child and I'm just concerned that they're using their screens too much, what are your 3 don't do this responses? What are the 3 things that you just don't cross this line, don't do this with the kids, it's going to blow up, there are better things to do? What are the 3 things, the most common mistakes parents make here?
I like that you framed that question in what do you don't do instead of what do you do.
So we're going to get there eventually.
You're really making me think here. Look, my first don't do is certainly around parents that go down the path of criticizing what their kids do online. If you've found yourself in a position where, you're sitting there going, that game is such a waste of time, it's going to rot your brain, and that social media is crazy, and you're always in there with that phone, and as soon as we do that, it becomes combative and your child is going to switch off. Sorry, not the screens. I mean, switch off to you and what you're saying, right? So
Yeah, wrong switch.
That's my first one. And I guess my other don't, if I just sort of flip this, if I use two, we have to be really careful about the access level that we give, especially around sleep. You've heard me talk about this before, Justin. Sleep is one of the primary factors here in my clinical experience where things can go downhill. So in all of those developmental domains in that study, what I have found clinically is that if your child is in a sleep deficit because they're up late at night grabbing a phone, or because you let them have a phone in their room to, listen to music on Spotify to help them get to sleep, which is the classic one.
Yeah.
But, you find them on something else, that will snowball on everything else quickly, on all these other developmental domains quickly. So, don't, even if you find yourself relaxing rules at other times because the horse has already bolted, don't relax those rules at night. Sleep has to be number one. And don't go down this path of just endlessly criticizing what they're doing online.
Okay, I'm going to add one if I can, because I said three and you've hit us with two. Your reactions are welcome if you disagree with me. I think that when we see our kids on screens and we've asked them to get off, or we've had this conversation 7,000 times, like this is a perennial issue, right? You never stop talking about screens once they've got one. It fundamentally becomes the center of their world, and it changes your relationship with them forever once they've got it. My big don't have the screen conversation when they're on a screen, or when you've got a head full of steam because they're on a screen, like high emotions, low intelligence. It's just not the time for it. You've got to pick your time, usually on a nice quiet Saturday or Sunday morning where everyone's relaxed and calm, and you can give them a chocolate milkshake or go down to the local cafe and get some wedges and sour cream and say, hey, I want to have a tricky conversation with you about that thing that's driving me up the wall. If you do it in the moment, you just create World War III in your living room.
Yeah. Look, I couldn't agree more, Justin, and I'd expand on that further to say, when your kids are coming off screens, if you've said, righto, mate, your hour is up, come off now, don't give them a terrible thing to go to. If you transition them to now it's time to do your maths homework, you are probably going to end in tears, right?
Brad, I reckon you and I could talk for about 77 hours about this and still not exhaust our things to share. There's so much more that I want to ask you, so much more that we could talk about and play around with ideas around. You've been extremely generous with your time, though, and there's no way that any parent could have listened to this and not have some really great parenting solutions to help them with their challenges. Thanks so much for your time. It's been an absolute delight, and hopefully when there's some more research that comes out that's just hot to trot and perfect for parents, we can chat again.
Thanks, Justin.
Dr. Brad Marshall is a Macquarie University academic. He is the unplugged psychologist, and he is now most recently appointed as the Chief Research Officer at Control Shift. He's written books, he's a speaker, and clearly you can hear he knows his stuff. Thank you so much for listening. We hope so much that this has been a useful conversation for you. The Happy Families podcast is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. If you'd like more information and more resources to make your family happier, check the show notes for Brad's resources and the studies that we've talked about and our previous podcasts, or just visit happyfamilies.com.au.